Our first conference, which was the psychology of boys at risk, indicators from 0 to 5, took place in Santa Fe in November 2015. And that was followed by a special issue of the infant mental health issue in January 2017. The second conference will take place also in Santa Fe on May 1st through 3rd at the Santa Fe Convention Center, and that the topic of that is the early origins of male violence. And along with that, there'll be a publication, which is the Infant Mental Health Journal, a special issue of the Infant Mental Health Journal that'll come out in January 2019. The conference will follow that 5 months later in May 2019. And the vehicle for organizing all of this is the Santa Fe Boys Educational Foundation, which has been in existence now since 2013, and was preceded by a lot of other activities in this area of my interest, which is, in general, what is happening to boys and why are they doing, speaking broadly, why are they doing so much worse than they used to do, and why are they having so much trouble? In the late 1990s and early 2000s, there was beginning a certain awareness that boys were not doing well. There was something that was referred to as the boy crisis. The indicators were not doing well in the educational systems. Not all boys, of course, but many. Not finishing high school, not going on to college. Some other indicators were certain psychological problems that manifested in ADHD, which we became aware of around then, and also autism, which is both of which are predominantly male psychopathologies, as they're called, and also a lot of antisocial behavior, which in some most extreme cases resulted in violence or gangs or other forms of criminality. Potentially a biological issue that makes boys uniquely vulnerable or susceptible. There was also a psychological issue that had to do with boys' early experiences in these single-family homes, and then there were social issues. I couldn't have articulated this at the time in the early 2000s, but I knew that there were all these pieces to it that needed to be understood. And so I took myself off to graduate school and did a doctorate on this subject, basically trying to orient all my research to understanding boys. Well, I've organized, as I said, a number of different conferences. In the early years, I invited people who were known to speak about particular topics. A lot of research was being done, kind of not really known to the general public, about gender differences very, very early in life, sometimes prenatally. It occurred to me that this would be an interesting thing to focus on for a year, and I did that. And I led a panel on boys in early life and some of the unique vulnerabilities. And one of the people who attended that panel, someone I later became quite close to in this area, and his name is Hiram Fitzgerald. He is a professor of psychology at Michigan State. And I invited Hiram and the other people who were on the panel to come and have breakfast. And I said, what's a good activity for a conference, for a foundation to do? And I got a lot of ideas, but Hiram especially came up with the notion of doing a conference on boys at risk, indicators from 0 to 5. That was the title. And Hiram was terrific at helping me invite people who we both thought would be good for this topic. So that was how we got the first one. We had this conference, and it had three different subtopics. It was, I would say, the general conference on boys at risk. One topic had to do with biology, another had to do with longitudinal research. I discovered that there was quite a bit of research out there that followed boys from prenatal period till they were 20, 30 years old, and tried to relate what was learned early on to certain behavioral outcomes later. The conference ended. I thought it was quite successful. A couple of months later, the Infant Mental Health Journal came out, the special issue, and was on the website, and even the New York Times and the Atlantic had run articles about some of the topics that were dealt with during the conference. So I thought like we'd really done something special, but I didn't know what the next one would be, and I was kind of looking for inspiration. Actually, the inspiration came 2 days after the conference ended. I opened up the Santa Fe New Mexican, and there was a letter there about men and violence. And it was a very interesting letter, very angry and judgmental letter, I thought. Not a letter that showed much sympathy to the issue or much understanding of the complexity of the issue. But it was a pretty strong letter, and I wrote a response to that letter saying, too bad the person who wrote this letter didn't attend our conference. They would have discovered that there were other facets of male development that need to be brought into this discussion about male violence if we are ever to do anything about it. An idea was sort of triggered in that, and but it seemed to me like a complex project to initiate, and one I needed some help with. So I went to one of the speakers from our first conference, a professor at University of Pittsburgh named Daniel Shaw, who had done a longitudinal study of boys from very early in childhood until the 20s, following their trajectories to see which of those children later as adolescents and adults became violent. And I asked him if he would help me recruit some people for a meeting in La Jolla, California, where we would sit around a table and discuss the viability of this topic and whether it made sense to talk about the early origins of male violence. So we had that meeting. Daniel Shaw was extremely helpful, and we sat around a table for 2 days. And out of that, I had enough of a sense of confirmation that this was a doable subject. One of the things that I was cautioned about was to make sure that the conference, that there was some kind of publication around this. And fortunately, the Infant Mental Health Journal was again interested in doing another special issue on the topic. The conference is titled The Early Origins of Male Violence. It's the second in our series of Boys at Risk conferences. What we know of the predecessors, in general, the predecessors of early violent behavior. There'll be another segment that has to do with interventions and ways to try to deal with the problem of male violence that results from early issues. And the third will be a policy discussion about the need for policy changes. Males are significantly responsible for most of the violence in society. Approximately 90% of those incarcerated in federal and state prisons are males. Those incarcerated for violent acts are males. So we know that very clearly. Minorities are disproportionately included in that 90%. es- especially African American and Hispanic minorities. But whites also constitute about 35 to 40% of the population in prisons for these reasons. So the conference will, by the way, deal with some of the issues that we see, that we know are related to inner city problems and historical factors that have resulted in inequalities and neglect of certain populations in this country. But that's not to say that those are the only populations that will be discussed. Psychopathy, mass murder, some political terrorism is, we know, often enacted by people who are white, Caucasian Americans. So we'll also deal with that problem as well. So one of the papers I wrote early on was in the 0 to 3 publications, and I talked about three factors that are particularly unique to boys. One is that they are slower to develop. They generally have a slower developmental timetable. It just takes boys a longer time to mature. Of course, I'm making a big generalization. There are some for whom that's not the case, but by and large, that is a very strong finding that we know from many different approaches to this problem. And we see it first in physiological vulnerabilities. Boys are more likely to suffer early morbidity and mortality. They're more likely to be born prematurely. They're more likely to have a whole host of problems very early in life. And while those may not really describe the population of boys in general, we have this idea that if that population which is seen to be most susceptible early in life will also be more susceptible to psychological problems, more vulnerable to psychological problems, so that if the caregiving environment very early in life is inadequate or somehow compromised, boys are proportionally more likely to be negatively affected by that than girls. In addition to that, there are problems with boys' tendency to externalize frustration. Boys are much more likely to have psychopathologies that relate to acting out, and such as ADHD, often seen in the classroom. Those, I think, in general would fall into the category broadly of psychological issues. But there are also biological issues that boys seem to be more vulnerable as a result of. And some of those have to do with testosterone. Some of those have to do with certain genetic issues that boys confront that girls might also confront, but to a lesser degree. There's a gene called the MAOA gene, which seems to be more likely to affect boys, and when it's combined with early inadequate caregiving, often results in antisocial behavior later. And that's a relationship that's been fairly well established. There are a number of different genetic outcomes like that boys seem to be more vulnerable to. There's also heart rate, which has been mentioned, the desire for the need, if a child has a an adolescent or adult has a low heart rate, the need for finding stimulation somewhere. It's a drive, actually. And one of the ways that people might seek that out is through the excitement of illegal activities, violating certain society-wide standards. And so it's been found that people, for example, in prison, males in prison for violence often or exhibit to a higher degree than the general population a low heart rate. Females also have a low heart rate, but fewer females have this condition than males. So when we talk about the social environment, we need to talk about not only poverty and inequality, but also how these affect family structure. And there has been a fairly significant change in the last, I would say, 30 to 40 years, where single parent families have come to be quite a significant part of the population. And one of the things through the study of this phenomenon, which is often studied as what is known as the fragile family, one of the significant outcomes that we are learning is that it affects boys and girls differently, and seems to have a particularly negative outcome on boys. If it's because boys, as I mentioned previously, are more biologically and more psychologically vulnerable early in life, and then combined with a family structure which is more likely to be problematic, is unclear. But when we look at all of these factors together, the end result is that it's been fairly well established in a number of very large, mostly economic analyses, that boys early in life who grow up in single mother households show a greater likelihood of doing poorly in school and in other behavioral outcomes later. So that's one way that you see how all of these other social factors can manifest in a family situation, which then combines with the bio and psychological factors to make boys have these outcomes, which we are increasingly seeing. That there's a fairly complex combination of factors that are taking place here that are setting boys up for a particular set of outcomes, which we see in school, in educational outcomes, antisocial behavior, and in general in certain psychopathologies. The way I see this as relating to policy issues and policy outcomes has to do with us accepting that there is more, there's something more, there's a much more complicated dynamic here, and that it needs to inform policy. It needs to inform the kind of interventions we have. It needs to inform the kinds of preschool programs that we have for children. I'll go into that just a little further, and that is New Mexico, for example, a state that the foundation is located in, has a history of kicking children out of preschool for behavioral problems. A study was done in 2005 by a professor at the Yale Child Study Center, showing that New Mexico was the worst state in the United States for kicking kids out of preschool, and that boys predominated. 80% of those dismissed were boys with behavioral problems. So it may be that if we can really come to grips with the fact that boys have this problem, and if we could become a little bit more sympathetic to it, we might think of ways to set up schools, particularly schools with teachers that are more aware of these problems that boys have, so that they also can get the advantage of preschool education, which we've come to see as so important as a society. But in general, it could inform interventions. People who do early home visitations could become a little bit more sensitive to the particular dynamics that go on between mothers and sons. And I don't think it would hurt at all, and could have a much more beneficial effect than these programs are having now. And of course, all this takes place within the context that we as a society have come to see what happens early in life as incredibly significant for later outcomes. And so that anything that helps us to understand what we can do better to address the needs of parents with their children early in life is incredibly important. And there's this particular approach that I hope the foundation becomes associated with, which is bringing the needs of boys in particular, boys that are problematic and later wind up creating so many social problems for society, that they're starting early to address some of these issues, and starting in a way that understands who the boy is, that's sympathetic to the boy's nature, and not just preaching the good way to behave by the time they're adolescents, when it's probably too late. Something that starts early and is sympathetic to boys will help tremendously, I think, in these kinds of programs that we are increasingly supporting. The Santa Fe Boys Educational Foundation exists to create an environment to discuss, to understand boys, to foster research and promote programs to address this growing awareness that boys early in life have particular needs which if we wish to avoid these later problems, need to be addressed in those early years, prenatal to say age 5. That is the main focus of the Santa Fe Boys Educational Foundation, and the idea is to create situations where these issues can be discussed and brought to public attention. So we are having conferences, we are publishing special issues of the Infant Mental Health Journal, and if we see, I'm also very interested if someone were to come to me and say, boy, I'd like to start a preschool for boys that would be particularly sensitive to some of the problems that they have. The foundation would be interested in that kind of program as well, supporting it and research for it. So that, in a broad brush, is what the foundation is trying to do.